Bitcoin is an emotional topic, and it's very difficult to find any neutral information out there. So this video is for investors who want both the bad and the good so they can make an educated decision for themselves. So first, let's look at the positives. One, Bitcoin is very well positioned for a currency collapse. And I know that sounds ominous, but we have to look at this from all viewpoints. We don't really know where this money printing and endless debt is going to lead us. But if we run into problems, Bitcoin is there to help conduct transactions digitally. Now, to be honest, it's not great for transactions. We'll speak more about that in a minute. But it's better than bartering with something like precious metals, particularly in this digital world we live in right now. Now, countries like Venezuela, they've already experienced this hyperinflation. They've seen increasing adoption of cryptocurrencies. In Venezuela, their whole country is just about to go completely digital currency. Now, despite a national digital currency that they've created, many citizens are continuing to trust Bitcoin more than they do the national options. And that's the problem with a currency collapse. It's very difficult to get people back into the system if they already have a better option. And this could be huge if we see a currency collapse here or even a major drop in currency value. Next up, millennials prefer Bitcoin as a store of wealth over gold. And we've also seen many investor groups, we'll speak about that more in a minute, moving from gold into Bitcoin to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. Now, you have to remember that investing isn't about what you want or expect to happen. It's about what is actually happening. So to just shrug off this meteoric rise that we've been seeing and the demographic changes relating to Bitcoin, I think can be dangerous. Now, next up, as we mentioned, are the institutional investors. These investment groups, to the tune of billions, are finding it harder and harder to ignore Bitcoin, especially with these triple-digit returns. We saw almost 300% return last year alone. Now, these institutional investors serve two purposes, both to drive up the price of Bitcoin with all that influx of cash, as well as adding this additional veneer of credibility to crypto as a whole. Now, if Bitcoin keeps going up, we're very likely to see more mainstream adoption by institutional investors as well as by the general public. Now, most people at this point still do not hold Bitcoin, and most people have basically just shrugged it off as a passing fad. But this is becoming increasingly hard to do as it has essentially beaten out almost all of the alternatives for ROI. Next up is the potential upside of Bitcoin. So the gold market cap right now is about $9 trillion. If we see mainstream adoption of Bitcoin by the general public to the extent that we have of gold, that's going to value an individual Bitcoin at around the $500,000 mark. So while today, $35,000, it might seem like quite a bit, it wasn't that long ago that people thought that you were crazy investing $1,000 for a single Bitcoin. Now, and for people who are new to Bitcoin, you actually don't have to buy an entire coin. You can buy smaller fractions of a Bitcoin called Satoshis. You can invest as little or as much as you like. Next is the practical application of Bitcoin. And this is driving reason behind the creation of it in the first place. A decentralized digital currency extracts the general population from these manipulative practices of the governments, the Fed, and the big banks. And a lot of people call Bitcoin the people's money, which is why I find it quite strange that the gold and silver stackers, who traditionally don't like big government, they've mostly ignored this aspect of Bitcoin despite this obvious benefit. Now, this is the most compelling reason I feel to be bullish for Bitcoin. There's an increasing mistrust of governments and their financial manipulation, increasing erosion of confidence in paper money, an untenable debt load, and ongoing cronyism that we see continuing to get worse. Now, also, if you are a proponent of cyclical theory, both social and financial, we are just about due on many fronts for major corrections. Bitcoin is very nicely positioned for that type of paradigm shift. Of course, that could change. So an overview of the good. It's the people's money. You get exceptional returns so far to date. Mainstream market adoption is happening, increasing public awareness, but still relatively early in the adoption cycle, so potential really strong upside. Now let's take a look at the negatives of Bitcoin. So first off, this is probably the biggest beef with everybody. It's impossible to value Bitcoin, and any price increases are only tied to the willingness of somebody else in the future buying my Bitcoins for a higher price. You always need buyers who are willing to pay more than what you had originally paid. There's no real underlying value. And this is the biggest beef, let's be honest, of Bitcoin bulls in general. And you know what? They're not necessarily wrong. Now, frankly, the same can be said for gold or silver or other types of metals. And while gold does have some practical value, most of it does tie back to investor sentiment by way of value. Now, this reliance of new buyers propping up the market, that's why we always hear this Ponzi pyramid scheme analogy. Now, there are specific arguments as to why Bitcoin is not following a typical Ponzi route. We're not going to cover those here, but I do openly accept the criticism that future gains are definitely tied to new buyers coming on board. Now, if we see a reversal in this bullish sentiment, we could see another crash like we did back in 2017. Now, next up, this is a big one, is increasing pressure from the government and SEC by way of regulation. So recently, Ripple XRP, that's another crypto, they were charged by the SEC for conducting $1.3 billion in unregistered securities offerings. XRP, it's a cryptocurrency similar to Bitcoin, I think a third or fourth place overall of all cryptos, but with a major difference. It is not decentralized and it is controlled by the corporate entity Ripple. Now, that same lawsuit could not be launched against Bitcoin because nobody controls it, nobody owns it. But the increasing scrutiny by the government on cryptos as a whole could ultimately have a downward pressure on mainstream adoption. And while it's unlikely the government could ever outlaw crypto altogether, they did outlaw gold ownership not that long ago and confiscated a lot of gold, so anything is within the realm of possibility. But if mainstream adoption continues, you've got all these investors, all these groups, all these organizations, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for the government to completely shut down Bitcoin. Next negative is the transactional viability of Bitcoin, which is rather low at this point. So transactions, be honest, they take forever, they're expensive, and it's just not in a position right now to take over using your debit card or your phone to make these instant, cheap payments. Now, that might change in the future with another crypto, and some of these third-generation cryptocurrencies have improved vastly on many of these problems that Bitcoin has. But that could just mean that Bitcoin could fade away as a fond memory as the first crypto, clunky and ultimately useless, and went the way of the dodo. Next negative of Bitcoin is the time that people waste checking the price of Bitcoin every single 10 minutes on their phone. And yes, I see you doing it. Time is your only true resource. Checking your phone every 5 minutes does not improve your quality of life. And if you have to obsess over these massive fluctuations of Bitcoin, you're not doing yourself any favors by being over leveraged in the market. So go outside and get some fresh air. Next up, the Great Reset movement is at odds with Bitcoin, and we're seeing a societal paradigm shift going towards a more eco-friendly world. Bitcoin mining uses a ridiculous amount of electricity, and last year alone, it was estimated to use as much electricity as the entire country of Switzerland, and that's probably higher this year with the craziness that's going on right now. Bitcoin in its current form is absolutely not earth-friendly, and there are other options that don't use this proof of work model, as it's called. So again, we may have a situation where we look back fondly at Bitcoin as the clunky, polluting Model T Ford of the cryptocurrency space. Last but not least, Bitcoin is not as anonymous as most people think, and it can present security issues. We've heard of many nightmares online, people being hacked or losing their coins in some nefarious way. But despite these ongoing issues, even the Mt. Gox scandal back in 2014, Bitcoin keeps chugging along. Mt. Gox, for those that don't know, the biggest crypto platform at the time, they had 850,000 Bitcoins hacked. It was worth millions even back then. But even that did not shut down Bitcoin. Now, interestingly, Mt. Gox, their creditors, did recover some of those Bitcoins and are apparently very close to refunding some of their customers. Now, a valid question is whether all those Bitcoin holders that have been waiting for 6 years for the crypto will all of a sudden cash out once they get their refunds. And if so, what impact is that going to have on the market? I don't think we have any good answers for that yet, so we're going to have to wait and to see. So the bad: price relies on future buyer sentiment. There's no intrinsic value for Bitcoin. Increasing SEC and governmental oversight. Lackluster transactional ability. Obsessive price checking is not healthy for you. Bitcoin mining is not environmentally friendly, and it can have security issues. So should you invest in Bitcoin? I can't tell you what to do. Depends on your risk appetite, your age, and many other things. Could we see a massive correction, especially since Bitcoin has blasted past 20,000 to 35,000 just in the last few days? Absolutely. Or we could see it go all the way up to $100,000 or more. Nobody's got that answer. Now, my personal feeling on this is that completely ignoring Bitcoin is no longer an option for anybody. I personally allocate relatively small amounts. I dollar cost average over time. That way, I'm not going to get rich, but I do have Bitcoin in case of emergency, and I certainly do see some decent returns. But I'm completely okay if the market tanks and if I lose everything. Now, a conservative investor might allocate 1% to 2% of their portfolio or more if they have a higher risk appetite. You can swap it out for some of your higher risk stocks. Nobody really knows where Bitcoin is ultimately going to end up, but these are exciting times with massive changes on the horizon. I hope for the better. Happy New Year to everybody out there. Thanks very much for watching. Please like and subscribe.